The great hall of the Galactic Council stood vast and silent. Its walls rose high, carved with glowing symbols of every empire in the galaxy. Leaders from 100 worlds sat in their seats, eyes fixed on the center stage. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the sound of heavy boots broke the silence. A veteran alien general stepped forward. His armor was scarred from decades of battles. His tusks were cracked. His yellow eyes glared across the chamber with the coldness of a predator who had seen too many wars. This was General Korath, survivor of 50 campaigns, destroyer of empires, feared even by his own kind. Korath's voice thundered through the hall. "Tell us," he growled, "why do they call humans dangerous? Why does the galaxy whisper your name with fear? You are fragile deathworlders, bones that break, flesh that burns, hearts that bleed. Show us why we should respect your kind." The council leaned forward. Every alien waited to see how the human would answer. From the shadows, a single human officer stepped into the light. He was not tall, not armored, not armed. His uniform was plain, dark blue, carrying only the insignia of Earth. His face looked calm, almost too calm. But his eyes told another story. They carried shadows of battles fought, of nights where fire and screams had never ended. The officer raised his head slowly. His voice was steady, not loud, yet it carried across the hall. "It is not the weapons you should fear," he said. "It is not our ships, not our bombs, not even our numbers. It is what we have done when everything was lost." The chamber grew colder. Whispers spread. The alien leaders looked at each other uneasily. Korath's grin widened, sharp teeth gleaming. "You speak of survival tricks," the general mocked. "Of running into holes and biting like cornered rats. Tell us, fragile human, do you think your tales of desperation frighten me? I have eaten the hearts of warriors. I have crushed enemies until their blood flooded rivers. What can your kind show me that I have not seen?" The human did not flinch. He only looked at the general with those shadowed eyes. "Let me tell you a story," the officer said softly. The council chamber stilled again. The human's words were not shouted. They were whispered, yet every alien leaned closer. "It was long ago," he began. "A time when our weapons were nothing but steel and fire. An army came to take a city. The city had no more food. No water. No reinforcements. The walls were broken, the soldiers starving. Any other species would have surrendered." Korath laughed, the sound deep and cruel. "Yes. And they died, I suppose? That is how weaklings end. I have crushed cities like that myself. There is no shame in it." The human's lips curled, but it was not a smile. It was something colder. "No," he said. "They did not surrender. They fought with nothing but stones. Starving men, women, even children. They rained rocks on armored invaders. They sharpened wood into spears when steel was gone. And when even the wood was gone, they threw their own bodies into the fire. They made the enemy choke on blood before they could claim victory." The laughter around the hall began to fade. Korath's smile weakened, his tusks grinding against each other. The officer's voice stayed calm, but his words were like knives. "Think of it, General. Soldiers with nothing left. No food. No hope. No chance of survival. Yet they fought until the invaders drowned in their defiance. And even when death came, it did not break them. Their resistance lived on in the enemy's nightmares." For a moment, no one in the chamber spoke. The silence was thick, heavy, pressing on every chest. Korath barked out another laugh, but it was weaker now. His voice cracked at the edge. "Rocks and sticks. This is your story. Pathetic. We, my kind, would never waste ourselves so foolishly." The human officer's eyes turned sharp, almost glowing under the chamber lights. "And that is why you will never understand us," he said. "Because when you lose everything, you break. When we lose everything, we become something else. Something your kind has never faced." The words echoed in the vast hall. Alien leaders shifted uneasily. One of them muttered in their own tongue, but the sound carried madness. They fight with madness. Korath's face hardened. He wanted to dismiss the human's tale, to laugh again, but something inside him twisted. He had seen armies crumble without supplies. He had watched soldiers abandon battle when hunger burned their stomachs. The thought of soldiers fighting with stones, with bare hands, refusing to surrender, it scraped against every instinct he had as a warrior. The human officer stepped closer, his boots clicking against the polished floor. His voice dropped lower, colder. "Do you know what the invaders said, General? They said it would have been better to fight a storm than to fight those starving humans. A storm breaks and passes. But those men and women, dying, broken, bleeding, would not pass. They became the storm." The chamber fell silent again. No one dared to move. Koratha's hand twitched. His claws tapped against the stone railing. The sound echoed like a nervous drum. For the first time in decades, the battle-hardened alien felt something he did not want to admit. Fear. The human's eyes locked on his. "And that, General," he said quietly, "was only the beginning of our wars." The chamber of the Galactic Council was still heavy with silence. General Korath shifted in his place, his tusks grinding softly. His eyes, once sharp and mocking, now carried a shadow he tried to hide. The story of starving humans hurling stones and refusing to surrender clung to him like smoke that would not leave his lungs. The human officer stood calm, his hands folded behind his back. He had not raised his voice. He had not boasted. Yet every word had pierced deeper than any blade. "Do you think that was the end of it?" the officer asked, his voice steady. Some alien leaders leaned closer. Others looked away, unsettled. None of them spoke. The officer continued. "Let me tell you another truth. In war, when supplies vanish and the stomach grows empty, most armies collapse. Soldiers abandon the field. Leaders surrender. But humans, no. That is when we become most dangerous." Korath snorted, trying to push away the unease in his chest. "Empty words," he barked. "An army without food is an army of corpses. You cannot fight on nothing." The human's gaze sharpened. "You think we cannot. But we have. And we will again if we must." He took a breath, his eyes distant, as though seeing battles long buried in time. "There was a siege, long after the one I told you. The enemy cut off every road, every river. The humans inside the city had nothing, no bread, no clean water. People drank rain mixed with mud. Soldiers boiled leather straps just to fill their bellies. Many should have died. But they didn't. They refused. They kept fighting." The hall filled with whispers. Alien counselors glanced at one another, their scales, feathers, and fur bristling with unease. The officer's voice lowered, but it carried with sharp clarity. "When our bodies failed us, we fought with will. When our arms grew weak, we stood together. Our enemies thought hunger would break us. Instead, it forged us. We learned to fight when there was nothing left to fight with." One council member, a thin insectoid with gleaming eyes, clicked nervously. "No, no species can endure that. Not without collapse." The human looked directly at the insectoid. "Collapse comes when there is no reason to fight. But humans, we always find a reason. Sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is revenge. Sometimes it is simply because surrender tastes worse than death." Koratha's jaw tightened. He remembered campaigns where hunger had destroyed entire fleets. He had seen warriors throw down their blades when rations ran out. But this human was telling him of soldiers who fought on mud and leather, who chose defiance even when death was certain. "You speak madness," Korath growled, though his voice trembled faintly. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You call it madness. We call it endurance." He stepped forward, his boots echoing softly in the great chamber. "Do you know what happens when humans lose hope, General? We do not surrender. We adapt. When we have no weapons, we sharpen sticks. When we have no sticks, we throw stones. When even stones are gone, we use our fists, our teeth, our very bodies. And when those fail, we still fight with memory and with fire, so the enemy never forgets that we stood." A long pause followed. The chamber seemed to grow colder. Korath opened his mouth, ready to spit out more scorn, but the words caught in his throat. His claws tapped against the stone rail, faster this time, like a drumbeat of unease. The human officer's voice softened, but its weight doubled. Tell me, General, have you ever faced an army that fights not for life, not for victory, but simply to deny their enemy peace? Korath froze. His eyes flicked to the ground. In his memory, he saw the faces of his own soldiers, faces that had broken when food ran dry, faces that had begged him for retreat. He imagined those same soldiers fighting with stones, mud, and fire. Fighting until nothing was left. The thought carved fear into his chest. The officer's gaze swept across the hall, capturing every alien eye. This is the first truth of humanity. We do not measure battles by weapons or by rations. We measure them by will. And when everything is gone, when every chance of survival is stripped away, our will does not break. It sharpens. No one spoke. The silence was a living thing, pressing against every council member. Finally, Korath forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, brittle. You want me to believe that starving humans could defeat trained armies? Impossible. A warrior without strength cannot fight. The human leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like thunder. Strength fades. Will endures. That is why you fear us, even if you do not admit it. The chamber's torches flickered. Somewhere in the high seats, a counselor muttered words the translation systems barely caught. Not strategy. Not survival. Something else. Something terrifying. Korath's fists tightened, but sweat glistened on his scarred skin. For the first time, the general felt the cracks in his certainty. And the human officer, calm and silent, stood unshaken. This, he said softly, is only the first truth. There are more. Far darker. Do you wish to hear them, General? The chamber went still. Even Korath did not answer. His silence said more than words ever could. The chamber of the Galactic Council was heavy with silence. General Korath's tusks clenched tight, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. The first two stories had already shaken him. The human's words lingered in the air like smoke, hard to breathe, impossible to ignore. The officer stood calmly, his uniform plain, his expression cold. His eyes, those shadowed human eyes, pierced every alien heart that dared to meet them. You think you know war, the officer said quietly. But there are wars we do not speak of. Wars not written in our books, wars whispered only in the nightmares of survivors. If you wish to understand humanity, General, you must hear them. Korath's voice was rough, strained. More tales. You hope to frighten me with ghosts. I have faced burning skies, oceans of blood. I have watched empires die. What could your fragile kind show me that I have not seen? The human's gaze hardened. You have seen armies fight for victory. But have you ever seen an army fight to deny victory? The chamber grew stiller. The air itself seemed to pause. The officer continued. There was a city once. Surrounded. No escape. The invaders wanted it whole, wanted to claim its people and its walls. But the humans inside made a choice. They burned their own homes. They poisoned their own wells. They destroyed everything, just to make sure the enemy would take nothing. A ripple of shock moved across the council chamber. Several aliens hissed in disbelief. The officer's voice stayed low and steady. Parents took torches to the houses they built. Soldiers destroyed their own fortresses. They fought not to win, but to erase themselves rather than let the enemy taste victory. And when the invaders entered, they found only fire and ash. Korath's throat rumbled. His mind twisted against the image. He had fought enemies who surrendered to save themselves, who begged for mercy. But to destroy one's own city, to choose ashes over survival, it was beyond logic. That is madness, Korath spat. No people would do this. No people would kill themselves willingly. The human stepped closer, his boots echoing on the stone floor. His eyes locked onto the general's. You call it madness. We call it memory. Because long after the city was gone, the enemy never forgot. They whispered of humans who burned themselves rather than kneel. And that memory lived longer than the city itself. The councillors shifted uneasily. Some looked down. Some looked away. The silence was broken only by the slow, steady tapping of the general's claws against the railing. The officer continued. Do you know of the battles where soldiers knew they could not win? Where they marched anyway, not to claim victory, but to make the enemy bleed. To remind them that every step forward would cost them more than they could bear. Koritha's eyes narrowed, but his jaw tightened. The human's words were digging deep, finding places he did not want touched. One such battle, the officer said, was fought on open plains. Outnumbered 5-1. The humans charged anyway. They fought until the ground itself drank so much blood it turned to mud. None survived. But the enemy did not rejoice. They trembled. Because they knew if 5-1 was not enough, how many would it take to truly break humans? A counselor muttered in a low tone, that is not war. That is something else. The human nodded slowly. Yes. Something else. Something you do not understand. We fight not only for life, not only for victory. We fight so that the enemy never forgets us, even in death. The chamber felt colder. Torches flickered as though the air itself recoiled. General Korith leaned forward, trying to hold on to his pride. His voice shook, though he forced it into a growl. Stories. Old stories. You speak of ashes and blood, of sacrifice without reason. Such waste. Such foolishness. The officer's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something colder. And yet it is the waste you fear most. Because you cannot control it. You cannot break an enemy who chooses to break themselves first. That is what terrifies you. The words struck like thunder. The general's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the chamber was silent again. Then the human officer leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the bones of every alien listening. There are wars we do not write down. Wars too bloody, too hopeless, too filled with madness. But we carry them in our memory. And memory is sharper than any blade. That is what you face when you face humanity. The silence deepened, heavy as stone. Koritha's eyes flickered, his confidence breaking, his body stiff as if trying to resist an invisible weight pressing down on him. He had thought himself unshakable. Yet now his hands trembled against the railing, and sweat trickled along his scarred brow. The human officer stepped back into the light. His calmness was more terrifying than any threat. These, he said, are the wars no one talks about. But they live in us. And they will live in you, too, if you face us. The chamber was still. The counselors dared not breathe. And for the first time in decades, General Korith said nothing. The chamber of the Galactic Council felt like a tomb. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and the silence weighed heavier than stone. General Koritha's tusks clenched as if to keep his jaw from trembling. His eyes refused to meet the humans, but every creature in the hall could see the unease in him. The human officer stood still. Calm. Patient. His voice had carried like a blade through the council's heart. But now, for the first time, he paused. He let the silence grow, let the unease crawl under alien skin. Finally, Korith forced out a growl. Your stories are ashes and corpses. They prove nothing. You humans praise defeat as if it were glory. No empire rises on such madness. No species survives by burning itself. The human turned his head slowly, eyes sharp as knives. His calm voice cut through the growl. You misunderstand, General. We do not praise defeat. We praise the refusal to submit. That is what you cannot grasp. Counselors shifted in their seats. Some tried to look stern, but the twitch of their mandibles, the flick of their tails, the tightening of their throats betrayed unease. They had never seen Korith, the unbroken warlord, hesitate. And yet here he was, trembling under the weight of words. The human took one step forward. You call us fragile. You call us weak. Yet weakness has forced us to become stronger than you will ever understand. Korith slammed a fist against the railing, the sound echoing like thunder. Enough. Words are smoke. Stories are shadows. Show me something real. Show me proof. The officer's eyes glinted. For a moment, it almost looked like a smile touched his lips, but it wasn't joy. It was something colder. Something dangerous. Proof, he said quietly. Very well. I will give you proof. He raised his hand. A small device blinked on his wrist, projecting a pale blue image into the air. The council gasped as a hologram formed, grainy, black and white, but clear enough. It showed a battlefield. Not of aliens. Not of other worlds. But of Earth. Men in torn uniforms staggered across muddy ground. Their faces hollow, their eyes sunken. Smoke covered the sky. Shells exploded. Horses screamed. And still, the humans fought. The officer's voice echoed over the image. This is from one of our wars. A war so terrible we called it the war to end all wars. We dug trenches into the earth and lived like rats. We starved. We froze. We drowned in mud. And yet, we kept fighting. The hologram shifted. Soldiers in gas masks marched forward, stumbling through clouds of poison. Dead men lay twisted in the dirt, but the living did not stop. They stepped over corpses, pushed forward through horror itself. Poisoned skies. Endless slaughter. Entire generations lost, the officer said, his voice steady. And still, humanity did not stop. Because we knew one thing: if we gave in once, we would give in forever. The chamber was deathly silent. No one laughed now. No one dared to mock. Coratha's voice, when it came, was lower, almost forced. You destroyed yourselves. This proves nothing but your madness. The officer turned to him, his face as cold as stone. Madness? Perhaps. But we endured. And when it ended, when the last gun fell silent, do you know what we did, General? We rebuilt. The very soil was poisoned, the skies black, yet we rebuilt. That is why you should fear us, not for our weapons, but for what rises from our ashes. He let the image fade. The hall felt darker without it. Korath shifted uncomfortably. His claws dug into the railing, as though trying to anchor himself. He had demanded proof, and proof had been given. Not in numbers. Not in victories. But in a truth far harder to bear: humanity's refusal to break. The officer's voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. Every species in this chamber fights for life. But humanity has fought for something more. We have fought for meaning. For memory. For the knowledge that if we must die, our enemy will remember us forever. That is why you cannot break us, General. That is why we are feared. The counselors leaned in, unable to pull away. The words hung like chains around their throats. Korath tried to speak but faltered. His mouth opened, then closed again. He had faced fleets, armies, firestorms, but never words that hollowed him out like this. The human officer straightened, his shadow long across the chamber floor. You wanted to know why humans are feared, he said. This is only the beginning. You have heard stories. You have seen glimpses. But there is a turning point, moments in our history when humanity became something more than survival. When we decided the universe itself would remember us. The silence after those words was unbearable. Even the torches seemed to dim, their flames bowing to the weight of his voice. Korath leaned back, sweat glistening under the lights. His silence was not victory. It was surrender of another kind, the surrender of certainty. The human officer let the moment linger. His eyes scanned the room, meeting every gaze, every trembling movement. And then he spoke once more. You wanted proof. You wanted truth. Now you have it. The turning point has come, General. Not for humans, for you. The chamber exhaled in one collective breath. The counselors realized what had just happened. The proudest general of the stars had been silenced, not by a weapon, not by an army, but by a single human voice. And in that silence, the universe itself seemed to shift. The chamber's silence was unbearable. It pressed on every scale, every feather, every carapace. Even the torches along the walls seemed to flicker weaker, as if they too feared the weight of what had been spoken. General Koratha's claws scraped against the railing, the sound sharp and grating. His tusks clenched until they cracked against each other. His chest rose and fell in heavy, uneven breaths. The warlord who had once shattered fleets now looked like a beast cornered by something it did not understand. Finally, the dam broke. His roar shook the chamber. Lies. Manipulations. Tricks of light and sound. Koratha's voice thundered. He pointed a trembling claw at the human. You speak of strength, but I see only weakness dressed in poetry. You glorify death because you have nothing else to offer. The officer did not flinch. He stood rooted, his shadow long, his face unyielding. His voice, when it came, was colder than steel. You shout, General, because you are afraid. Not of me, not of humans, but of what my words make you see in yourself. Gasps rippled through the chamber. No one had ever dared accuse Korath of fear. The general's roar deepened, more desperate now. You think endurance is strength. You think dying makes you worthy of fear. I have slain worlds. I have ground civilizations to dust. What is a human compared to that? The officer's eyes glinted, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips, not of joy, but of certainty. A human, he said quietly, is what remains after your dust has settled. We are what crawls from the ashes you leave behind. You can shatter a world, General. We will rebuild it. You can kill millions, but the survivors will rise with fire in their hands. That is why you lose to us, not in battle, but in the memory of battle. You cannot erase us. Korath slammed his fist against the railing, the sound like thunder rolling through stone. I will erase you. I will burn your species until not even your ashes remain. The human officer stepped forward. His eyes locked with Korath's, unblinking. His voice was calm, too calm. Then you will fail, as all who came before you failed. Because we do not fight for survival alone. We fight so our enemies will never forget us. Do you understand, General? We would rather become the nightmare in your children's dreams than be erased. The counselors shuddered. Some gripped their seats, others folded their wings or pulled their cloaks tighter. None could look away. Korath's roar cracked, turning into something raw, almost pained. You are nothing. Nothing but flesh and bone. The officer's reply came like a knife. And yet here you stand, shaking before flesh and bone. Tell me, General, why do you tremble? The question struck harder than any weapon. The hall froze. Korath's breathing quickened, sweat glistening on his scaled brow. His claws dug so deep into the railing that blood began to seep from his palms. The officer did not let him recover. His words pressed harder, faster, sharper. You claim to have crushed empires. Then why does a single human voice unmake you? You call us fragile, yet your fury betrays you. Perhaps you know the truth. Perhaps deep in your warlord's heart, you have always feared us not for what we are, but for what we cannot stop being. Korath staggered back a step, as if struck. His massive frame shook, not from rage alone, but from something worse, recognition. The officer's voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried through the hall like thunder. You fear us because you know this. Even in silence, even in death, humanity never stops fighting. We fight with memory. We fight with legacy. We fight with the echoes of our defiance. That is why you break, General. That is why this moment will haunt you until your last breath. Korath roared again, but this time it was not fury, it was denial, a sound too hollow to carry weight. He lunged forward, as if to strike, but stopped short. His claws hovered inches from the officer, frozen. The council guards shifted uneasily, hands on their weapons, but the officer did not move. He simply stared into the general's eyes. Do it, he whispered. Strike me. Prove to this council that you are not afraid. Or, remain frozen, and prove what I have already shown them. The silence was unbearable. Korath's claw trembled, but it did not fall. His chest heaved, his eyes wild, his tusks grinding together. For all his power, for all his pride, he could not bring his strike down. The officer leaned in, his words soft as venom. This is the breaking point, General. Not for me. For you. The chamber erupted not in sound, but in realization. Every counselor saw it. The warlord who had broken 100 species had himself been broken not by a weapon, not by an army, but by a human who never raised his hand. Korath stumbled back, his shoulders shaking, his voice cracking into something almost human, something like despair. No, no, this is trickery. But no one believed him. The officer stood tall, his voice steady as stone. No trickery. Only truth. And now the council knows it. The hall remained frozen in that truth. A warlord shattered. A human unbroken. And the weight of a silence more powerful than any weapon filled the chamber. The chamber lay in a silence thicker than any roar. General Korath stood trembling, his claw still frozen mid-strike, his mighty frame undone by a single human's words. The great warlord of the Scourge looked less like a conqueror now and more like a shadow of one, his breaths ragged, his tusks gnashing with helpless fury. The councillors shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the fallen general and the unyielding human. Their wings twitched, their tendrils coiled, their scales rattled. None dared speak first. Finally, the presiding councillor, an elder with eyes like molten stone, broke the silence. "Human," he said slowly, his voice quivering. "You have unmade a warlord before our eyes. Words alone, no blade, no fleet. Tell us now what lies beneath this silence of yours. What do you conceal in 3 centuries of quiet?" The officer looked up, his gaze sweeping across the chamber. His voice came low, calm, but unrelenting. "You ask what silence means to us. To most, silence is absence. To us, it is a weapon. The sharpest one we wield." A murmur rippled through the council. The officer continued. "When a human battlefield falls silent, it is not because we are weak. It is because we are watching, waiting, thinking, planning. Silence is the space between the strike and the counterstrike. It is where fear grows. It is where enemies unravel themselves before we need to lift a hand." His eyes cut to Korath, still trembling. "Look at your warlord. Broken not by our armies, not by our fire, but by his own reflection in our silence. He shouted because he could not endure the weight of waiting for what might come. That is the human gift. We let you break yourselves." The councillors whispered, some nodding, others recoiling. One cloaked delegate hissed. "Dangerous. Too dangerous. If silence itself is their weapon, how can they be stopped?" The human officer did not smile, but there was something sharp in his expression. "You cannot stop silence. You cannot destroy an absence. You cannot kill what you cannot hear, cannot see. That is why empires fall to us. Not in the clash of steel, but in the stillness that follows." The elder councillor leaned forward, his molten eyes narrowing. "Then tell us, why 3 centuries? Why did your world vanish from the stars for so long?" The officer's voice dropped to a whisper, and yet it carried to every ear. "Because silence is not only a weapon. It is a promise. For 300 years, we promised the galaxy that when we spoke again, it would change everything." The chamber seemed to tilt, the very air thickening. Councillors clutched their robes tighter. Even the guards, trained to show no fear, stiffened. Korath barked, his voice breaking. "Empty word. You hide your weakness in riddles. You vanished because you were broken." The officer turned to him, eyes sharp as blades. "If you believe that, General, then why do your claws shake? Why do your knees weaken? Why does your empire tremble at the thought of our return?" Korath staggered back another step, his pride collapsing beneath the weight of truth. The officer raised his voice, not in anger but in command. "The silence of Earth was never weakness. It was preparation. While you warred and bled each other dry, we listened. We learned. We remembered. And now we speak. And when humanity speaks, the galaxy changes." A silence deeper than before followed. But this time, it was not human silence alone, it was the silence of fear spreading through the chamber. One councillor whispered, almost too soft to hear. They waited. For what?" The officer's eyes burned with something ancient, something unyielding. "For the right moment," he said. "And that moment has come." The words struck harder than any fleet. The council chamber shivered, filled not with noise but with realization. Silence had been the greatest declaration humanity ever made. It had been a pause before the storm. And now the storm had spoken. General Korath sank to his knees, tusks gnashing, his voice cracking like a child's. "This cannot be." The human officer turned away from him, his gaze sweeping the council like a blade across a field of grass. "Your time of underestimating us is over. The silence is broken. Now, You will see what follows. The chamber's torches hissed, the shadows growing long, as if the very galaxy leaned closer to listen.